Welcome to Chapter 8. This week we're going to be looking at what is known as the aorist tense. Again, just to remind you here with Vera Verb that with Vera we have our tenses. She is very tense from her tears, and tense reminds us that verbs tell us the time of action and the type of action. So far you've learned three other tenses. You learned the present tense, which we've been working with quite frequently, which is present time with continuous action. And then you looked at the imperfect tense, which was past time with continuous action. And now, future tense, you looked at, which tells you the action was going to be happening sometime in the future, and we didn't know for sure if it was continuous or momentary. Today we're going to be dealing with the aorist tense, which is past time and it's momentary action. And although it is similar to the imperfect tense in that the action has happened in the past, there is some important differences. With the aorist tense, it expresses an undefined action in the past. It's actually a snapshot of the past action. We don't know if this action was completed or if it was ongoing. For example, when the sentence below it says, "Yesterday I raked leaves." Now, that sentence helps us to understand that yesterday I had actually raked some leaves, but it doesn't tell us whether or not I finished the job. Again, it's like looking at a snapshot of some action that took place in the past. We can see that something happened, but we're not sure if it was an ongoing action or if the action was completed or not. Unlike the imperfect, which does tell us that the action happened in the past and was ongoing. Now, in the aorist tense, we're going to see that there are two different types of aorists, and it's not all that different from what we have in English. Because in English, we can actually form the past tense in two ways. We can simply say, "I jump" in the present tense, but if we want to make it a past tense verb, we simply add the letters ed on the end of the verb, and it no longer is "I jump," but it means now it is "I jumped," which means something that I did in the past. But sometimes in English we can't just simply add an ed, so we change the spelling of the word. Instead of saying "I throwed," which we do not say in English, we then transform "I throw" to "I threw." A simple change in the spelling of the word helps us to convey that we're talking about action that happened in the past. In Greek, there are two types of aorist. We will call them first and second aorist. And just as you've just seen above here in English, that sometimes we can just simply add something to it to make it past tense, and sometimes we can simply change the spelling in order to communicate past tense. The same thing is going to happen for us in the aorist tense. Now, how do we form the aorist tense? Well, in the present tense, remember we had our verb stem plus our verb ending, which then resulted in our present tense of luo. In the imperfect tense, you learned about how to use augments. And in the imperfect tense, we used our augment, then our verb stem plus our verb ending, and we ended up with something like eluon, which was "I was loosing." In the future tense, you learned how to use suffixes, in this case specifically the sigma suffix. We took our stem, we added our sigma suffix to the ending, and that became our future tense, luso, "I will loose." Now in the aorist tense, we're actually going to combine the skills that we've learned in all three of these. In the aorist tense, we're going to have an augment, just like we did in the imperfect tense. Of course, as always, we'll have our stem. But we're also going to have a sigma suffix, although it's going to be expanded just slightly to be a sigma alpha. And then we're going to have our ending. And so it will be an augment, a stem, a sigma suffix with an alpha ending, and we would have elusa, "I loosed." Let's take a look at the way that this is formed. On your screen, you're looking at the paradigm for the first aorist active indicative. Notice that, of course, in the black in the middle is our stem from lu. all of our stems here begin with an augment, the epsilon augment. And then notice that we have a sigma alpha ending in most of these that helps us to remember that it is the aorist tense. So we have in the first person singular, elusa, I loosed. Second person singular, elusas, you loosed. Third person singular, elusen, he, she, or it loosed. Noticed here a movable nu for the third person singular. In the plural, we have elusamen, we loosed. In the second plural, elusata, you loosed. And then elusan, they loosed. Notice again that the important clue for you when you're dealing with the first aorist active indicative is the augment and your sigma ending and your sigma alpha ending, with of course the exception of the third person singular, which does not have an alpha in that ending. Also, notice that unlike the imperfect tense, here you can just simply add ed. Remember, for instance, if this was a imperfect tense, you wouldn't say I loosed, you would say I was loosing in order to communicate that ongoing continuous action in the past. But because we're talking about simple past in the aorist tense and it's an undefined action, we just simply say I loosed. There's no reason to add the words was or were to this translation. Now, by introducing our sigma suffix to a verb stem, just as we did in the future tense, this means that we're going to have some changes that come into effect with our verb stem, just like we did in the future. So let me just go over as a way of reminder for you some of those changes. Remember that when a verb stem ends with a labial, that is the consonants that you use your lips to say, the pi, the phi, or the beta, when it comes in contact with that sigma suffix, it transforms into a psi. So in this case, pempo becomes epempsa. Notice that we have our augment, our stem, and then where you would expect the sigma suffix before our alpha ending is become now a psi. So epempsa becomes aorist active indicative, first person singular, I sent. With our gutturals, that is the consonants that we say from the noise comes from the vibration in our throat. We have our kappa, our gamma, and our chi. When we add a sigma suffix to the end of a stem that ends with those, it ends up with the letter xi. So our example here, we have dioko, which when it is put into the aorist tense, it has its augment with its sigma suffix, then transformed into an xi with its alpha ending. It becomes dioxa. Dioka meaning I pursue or persecute. So in the aorist tense here, we have an aorist active indicative, first person singular. I pursued or I persecuted. And then finally, in our suffix changes, remember that we have the dentals. Those are the consonants that we form with our tongue and our teeth, our delta, our theta, and our zeta. When we add the sigma to a stem that ends in one of these consonants, then the sigma simply overrides them and it becomes just simply a sigma. So here we have patho in the aorist tense becomes epesa. And so in this case, epesa is a aorist active indicative, first person singular, and it is I persuaded. Now, just as when you were learning the future tense, we told you that you were only learning the middle voice at that time, that you would be learning the passive tense later on in a separate lesson, then that rule also applies to what you are learning today. The endings that I'm about to teach you are only for the middle voice, not the passive. You will actually be learning both the aorist and the future passive voice together in about 2 weeks in a separate lesson. And when we do that, you'll see why we teach those to you together. But with that in mind, let me introduce you then to the first aorist middle indicative endings. There they are on your screen. Notice once again you have your epsilon augment, your stem, and then there's your sigma suffix, and then followed by your endings. Elusamein, I loosed for myself. Eluso, you loosed for yourself. Elusata, he, she, or it loosed for him, her, or itself. In the plural, elusamatha, we loosed for ourselves. Elusasta, you loosed for yourself. And elusanta, they loosed for themselves. Please notice, if you will, the second person singular. There is some potential for stumbling. In the second person singular, we have eluso, which, if you're not paying careful attention to the fact that we have an augment on the front of this word, you might think that it's just simply luso, which is a future tense. But please notice that even though it could look like the future tense with that sigma omega ending, that augment makes all the difference in the world, telling you that it is an aorist middle, not a future. All right, with that in mind, let's take a look at a few practice words here. Epempsa. This will also help us to see how to do the parsing. Epempsa, we know this comes from pempo, which means that I send. This is an aorist active indicative, first person singular, and it means simply that I sent. Our second word on the screen there is agorasan, comes from agorazo. This is an aorist active indicative, third person plural. Notice that the eta on the front is the lengthening that happened, just as you saw with the augment and the imperfect. Agorazo actually begins with an alpha, so that alpha in the augment here of the aorist, just like in the imperfect, lengthened to an eta. And so we have agoradson, and it becomes, instead of I buy, to they bought. Prosuxemain is an aorist deponent indicative, first person plural, comes from prosukamai. Keep in mind that your deponent, and so in this case prosukamai will take the middle voice ending, and it is simply I prayed. Finally, elusanta from luo. In this case, it is an aorist middle indicative, third person plural, meaning they loosed for themselves. Now, I told you that there is both a first and a second aorist that you need to learn. And so with that, let's shift gears to our second aorist. I want to introduce you to a new character who will be with us throughout the rest of the course. This is Baal. And Baal is going to be our representative for the second aorist. Notice that he is carrying a pair of arrows there. He's carrying 2 arrows, in fact. This is to help remind us that we are dealing with the second aorist. Arrows sounds like aorist. And there's a couple of things about the second aorist that you want to know. First of all, similar to the imperfect, we're going to have an augment plus a stem and an ending. Okay? But rather than having a sigma suffix like we have in the first aorist, the second aorist does not have that. It's just a simple augment, a stem, and an ending. Then you might be asking yourself, well, how are you going to tell the difference then between a first and a second aorist without that sigma suffix? Well, that's because there's going to be an internal change that takes place. That is a difference in the spelling of the word. That will be your clue that you're dealing with the second aorist, and that's why Baal has got this rather large belly on him, because he's got some kind of internal change happening to him there that will remind you. So for forming the second aorist, we have our augment, we have our verb stem, which then goes through an internal change, and our verb ending. And so take a look on the screen there. We have balo, which when we put it into the second aorist, we have our epsilon sigma. Notice that we have an internal change. Balo, which is normally spelt with 2 lambdas, now is only spelt with 1 lambda. And then we have our second aorist endings, which is in this case our omicron nu. And so balo in the second aorist becomes ebalan, which means I threw. Let's just take a moment and make a few observations about the second aorist. First of all, Second aorist has a different spelling, that is our internal change, from that of what you would normally see in the present tense. The second aorist has no sigma alpha suffix. But what it does have is it actually uses the very same endings as the imperfect tense endings. And that's a bit of good news for you today. You do not have to memorize a second set of endings for the second aorist. You can use the same endings you learned with the imperfect tense. The difference is going to be you just need to remember that when they appear on the second aorist verb, you know that they are second aorist rather than imperfect endings. And I'm going to help you to know exactly how that happens in just a few moments. First, let's take a look at our paradigm for the active. The second aorist active indicative looks like this, and we're going to use bal here instead of lu, because lu does not appear in a second aorist active form. Bal, however, does. So here you have the word balo, which in the second aorist becomes ebelan, ebeles, ebele or ebelen in the third person singular with our movable nu, ebalamin, ebalata, and then again ebalen. Again, notice here that all of these have the augment, which is your first clue that you are not dealing with the present tense. Notice the internal change of bal. Because there is only one lambda instead of two, you know that you're dealing with the second aorist instead of the imperfect. And there are the imperfect endings, which in this case double up in our second aorist. This is why it's been important, and I've stressed to you all along that you need to pay attention to how the words are spelled when you learn them. Okay, because the change in spelling is going to be key here. You will, I guarantee, stumble a few times when you work with the second aorist of balo, thinking that it is imperfect, but you'll need to keep in mind that just the slight change in spelling, in this case, the dropping of the second lambda, tells you that you are not dealing with the imperfect, but with the second aorist. So in this case, ebalon with one lambda means I threw, instead of ebalon with two lambdas in the imperfect, which would mean I was throwing. Let's take a look at the second aorist middle indicative. Here we have ebalamain, which means I threw, but actually it should be I threw for myself. Pardon the mistranslation there, but what's more important here is to notice your endings. Ebalamain, ebalu, ebaleta, ebalamatha, ebalestha, ebelanta. And these would be I threw for myself, you threw for yourself, he, she, or it threw for yourself, and then we threw for ourselves, you threw for ourselves, they threw for themselves. Keep in mind here that these are not passive, they are only the middle. You will be learning the middle later. Now, what is the clue for helping you to memorize or to know when you're dealing with a second aorist verb rather than imperfect? And the good news is that there are only 13 second aorist verbs that you need to know. You're going to learn them as second aorist verbs. And so just like with the future irregulars, I'm recommending that you learn them as 13 separate vocabulary words to help you memorize them. Only these verbs will appear in the second aorist form when you learn them. All of the verbs will appear in the first aorist. So, in the second aorist, the verb erkamai, I come, becomes elthon, I came. Horao, which means I see, in the second aorist will become adon, which means I saw. Lego, which means I say, will become apon, and it would be simply I said. Okay, so far this is the first three you need to memorize. Notice that this is the word that it comes from, and then this is the word that it actually becomes in the second aorist, and all of these are using the second aorist endings that I just taught you, which of course are exactly the same ones that you learned as the imperfect. So while you don't have any new endings to learn, you do need to learn 13 new vocabulary words that will only appear this way in the second aorist. You'll only see aelthon, aedon, and apon as second aorist verbs. They will always be that way as second aorist. Let's take a look at some of the other ones. Eurisco, which you know in the present tense means I find. When it enters the second aorist, it will become euron, I found. Estheo, which in the present tense means I eat, will become ethagon, which means I ate. I go, which means I lead, becomes egagon, which means I led. Echo, which you know in the present tense as I have, when it enters into the second aorist tense, becomes eskon, and it just simply means I had. And then trecho, which means I run. When it enters into the second aorist, it becomes edramon, which means I ran. All of these would be parsed as a second aorist active indicative first person singular, the way that they're presented on the screen. But as you change out all the various endings, then you would just simply change your parsing from second aorist active indicative first person singular to whichever person and number that is there. Let's take a look at the last ones that we have here. We have just 5 more. Fugo, which means I flee, becomes efugan, which means I fled. Apathnesko, which means I die, becomes apathenon, I died. Pipto, which means in the present tense I fell, becomes epeson, I fall. Ginomai, which means I become, becomes egenomein, I became. And then finally, lambano, right, which means I receive, becomes elaban, I received. Notice one thing there about ginomai. It's a deponent verb, so it always takes those omai endings. And so notice that egenomein is going to take middle endings. All right, just a few more things as we wrap this up. Just as you learned infinitives for your aorist, okay, for your present tense and your imperfect tense, you're also going to learn it for your aorist. Lusai is your active, lusasthai is your middle, and luthanai is your passive. Notice one thing, though, here in your translation, lusai is not going to be translated in the past tense. You're not going to say, for instance, too lucid. The translation is still going to sound present, so lusai will be too loose. Lusasthai would be too loose for yourself, and luthanai will be to be loosed. Keep that in mind, and we will cover that a little bit more closely in class. But in the aorist tense, the infinitive does not take the ed ending for the past tense. It's just simply lusai, to loose, lusasthai, to loose for yourself, or luthanai, to be loosed. Here's a little memory device which will haunt you for the rest of your life. We have infant Ivy there standing with Lou. All right, and Lou's carrying an arrow, which is the aorist, to remind you, all right, that you're dealing with the aorist tense. There is a sigma sun between Lou, our stem, and to remind you of the sigma ending, and there is our aorist infinitive endings. We have psi there, and psi is wearing a sasthai and saying ani, which reminds you of your aorist infinitive endings, psi with a sasthai, thani. This will haunt you for the rest of your life, I promise you. Also, there are some second aorist infinitive endings. We have bal here again. Notice that there is bal with our internal change. These aorist infinitive endings will only take place on the 13 second aorist verbs that I've taught you, bal and those other 13 that I taught you. So you've got balein, balesthai, and graphenai. In the case of the first two, we show you these. These are the same ones that you learned in your present tense, ain and esthai. In the passive tense, what you learn later, we use grapho because that's the way it shows up most commonly. So just become familiar with these. And again, just with the aorist tense, first aorist, it's not balein is not to through. It's just simply to throw. Balestai is to throw for yourself. Graphenai is to be written. And there is our memory device. You've got bal in the ain or the rain with an esthai, bal in the rain with an esthai, ani. That's your memory device. In preparation for your classwork on Wednesday, excuse me. As always, learn the vocabulary for Chapter 8. Memorize the first aorist endings. Learn the 13 second aorist verbs that I taught you. Learn the first and second aorist infinitives. And then complete at least 10 of the Chapter 8 practice sentences that are in your workbook. And when we get together for class, we'll go over this again and begin to work our way through the aorist translation.